This presentation, prepared by Maddie, Taylor, Lauren, and Kelsey, will cover the schools of developmental and personality psychology. Within the presentation, Maddie will provide an in-depth analysis/review of each school of thought's perspective. Taylor will discuss the contributions to the field of psychology that each school provides. Lauren, will discuss the contemporary view for each theory proposed by each school. Kelsey will discuss potential reasons to why these topics are important in the history of psychology. She will also compare and contrast the two schools. Throughout the presentation, you will find a comprehensive discussion on both the history and the systems of psychology involved in the development of these two schools.
To start off developmental psychology, I have a poem from William's Wordsworth. The poem is "The Child is Father of the Man." My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man. I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. Many believe that this poem by Williams Wordsworth is suggesting that a person is, as an adult, depends largely on the experience that he has in childhood, which helps lead in to developmental psychology. To start off developmental psychology, the poem by William Wordsworth helps propose questions that are some of the basis of what developmental psychology aims to answer today. To what extent is the adult you are today influenced by the child you once were? To what extent is a child fundamentally different from the adult he or she grows up to be? And why is the study of development so important? Developmental psychology is not just about the physical development of a person. It also focuses on the cognitive, social, intellectual, perceptual, personality, and emotional growth of a person throughout their lives. Most of these are monitored during childhood because at this time is where there's the most change occurred. These areas are important in helping with our total understanding of how people change and grow throughout their lives. Knowing and understanding these things can help professionals with certain developmental concerns of a person and work to offer assistance to children and adults facing these developmental problems. With combined data and analysis, we are able to create timelines in how people mature and different factors that can influence the changes and growth of an individual. This makes it easier to find when and where a person could possibly have a problem in their development, and when there needs to be an intervention to help them get back on track. We're going to look at different influences and changes that can affect a person's development. The first is nature versus nurture. This comes into play with development because of the influences on genetic, inheritance, and biological factors in nature, and the more external factors like personal experiences that are found in nurture. Nature versus nurture has two questions proposed. How much does each contribute? And how do nature and nurture interact? Nature refers to the processes of biological maturation. One of the reasons why development of human beings is so similar is because of our common species heredity, or DNA, guides us through many of the same developmental changes at around the same points in our lives. Nurture refers to the impact of environment, which involves the process of learning through experiences. Nature helps us understand why we're the same, and nurture helps in understanding why some of us are different from each other. This is because not all of us have lived through the same experiences and not grown up the same way. This is why our parents have big impacts on our lives, because not having a mother or father can help with explaining the differences between people who have both. There are two effective ways to study nature versus nurture. The first way is through twin studies. Identical twins have the same genotype, so the same biological makeup, and fraternal twins have an average of 50% of the genes being the same. So studying those can show the differences between the two and how each react to different situations. The second would be adoption studies. Similarities with biological families support nature, while similarities with the adoptive family would support nurture. The first is nature versus nurture. This comes into play with. Next is stability and change. Stability implies personality traits present during infancy endure throughout the lifespan. In contrast is change. Change theorists argue that personalities are modified by interactions with family, experiences at school, and all creation. This capacity for change is called plasticity. For example, Rudder, 1981, discovered that somber babies living in understaffed orphanages often become cheerful and affectionate when placed in a socially stimulated adoptive homes. This relates to change and how experiences can change how a person's personality and how they develop are. The last thing of developmental psychology that I'm going to be talking about is attachment. Attachment is the emotional bond that forms between an infant and caregiver, and it is the means by which the helpless infant gets primary needs met by the caregiver. It then becomes an engine of subsequent social, emotional, and cognitive development in the child. The early social experience of the infant stimulates growth of the brain and can have an enduring influence on the ability to form stable relationships with others in the future. There are 4 attachment styles that I have listed: secure, dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied, and fearful avoidant. These will be explained later in the presentation. Personality refers to a person's distinctive patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. It derives from a mix of innate dispositions and inclinations along with environmental factors and experiences. We are wanting to understand how personality develops and how it influences how we behave and interact with others. Personality varies among individuals. However, there are some people who are very similar to each other. There are also people who are very different from each other. Although personality can change over time, one's core personality traits tend to remain relatively consistent during adulthood. While there are countless characteristics that combine an almost infinite number of ways, people have been trying to find ways to classify specific personalities ever since Hippocrates and ancient Greeks proposed 4 basic temperaments. Hippocrates theorized that personality traits and human behaviors are based on 4 separate temperaments associated with 4 fluids, or as mentioned, humors of the body. Choleric temperament is from the yellow bile from the liver. Melancholic temperament is the black bile from the kidneys. Sanguine temperament is the red blood from the heart, and the phlegmatic temperament is the white phlegm from the lungs. For example, the choleric person is passionate, ambitious, and bold. The melancholic person is reserved, anxious, and unhappy. The sanguine person is joyful, eager, and optimistic. And the phlegmatic person is calm, reliable, and thoughtful. In the diagram below, it shows the breakup of the 4 temperaments that Hippocrates hypothesized, and it breaks up other personality traits that they can have. Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic theory aims to answer, have you ever done something that didn't make any sense? Well, Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic perspective of personality was the first comprehensive theory of personality explaining a wide variety of both normal and abnormal behaviors. The psychodynamic perspective emphasizes on unconscious psychological processes, which is why you sometimes do stuff that doesn't make sense. For example, wishes and fears, which you're not fully aware of, and contends that childhood experiences are crucial in shaping adult personality. The psychodynamic perspective has evolved considerably since Freud's time, and now includes innovative new approaches such as object relation theory and neuropsychoanalysis. Today, psychologists often describe personality in terms of five basic traits. In other words, the Big Five. The Big Five are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. A newer model called Hexaco incorporates honesty and humility as a sixth key trait. Today,
Mary Ainsworth had lasting impacts on the field of developmental psychology. She spent a significant part of her life researching and working alongside John Bowlby. Ainsworth is known as the Canadian-American psychologist who developed a strain situation, which is a laboratory procedure for testing attachment. While conducting in-home observations, Mary Ainsworth found 3 different attachment styles that children had with their caregiver. The first attachment style is called secure attachment, and this occurs when the baby is distressed by the mother's departure but soothed by her return. The second attachment style is called avoidant attachment, and this takes place when the baby isn't distressed by his mother's departure and shows little interest in her return. The final style is called anxious attachment, and this is when the baby is distressed by his mother's departure but isn't soothed by her return. Mary Ainsworth conducted several observational studies where she explored how mother-infant bonds are formed. She paid specific attention to what takes place when this is disrupted. Her main finding was that babies were extremely active in their relationship with their caregiver. The babies used their mother as a secure base, and when they would go explore the environment, they knew that they could go back to their mother when they were distressed. Albert Bandura is a Canadian-American psychologist best known for his Bobo doll experiments exploring the social learning of aggression in young children. The Bobo doll experiment consisted of 4-year-old boys and an adult. They played with Tinker toys, and eventually the adult would act aggressively toward the Bobo doll, including things like pushing it on the floor, hitting it, and tossing it in the air. After the adult left the room, the children would act aggressively toward the Bobo doll. The children who did not witness their aggression towards the doll did not act aggressively toward it. The experiment went on to scold and praise the actions of the adults being aggressive. Children who witnessed the praise acted in aggression, and children who witnessed the scolding rarely showed aggression. Agoraphobia is the fear of leaving home or going into public places, and social cognitive theory is a proposal that people construct their own lives by choosing for themselves which models to emulate and which to reject. These were both key topics in Bandura's work. Jerome Kagan is an American developmental psychologist who has argued for the role of temperament in the formation of attachment style in infancy and personality in adulthood. Jerome spent a great amount of time researching separation fear, and he defined it as an infant's distress as its caregiver departs. They cry because they know she is gone and that she was recently just there. Jerome believes that infants' reactions to unfamiliar experiences can predict adult personality. The low reactive infants who show little fear of strangers typically grow up to be extroverted adults. High reactive infants that are fearful of strangers often become introverted in their later adult life and experience high levels of anxiety when challenged. Floyd Allport was especially interested in social psychology. He is known as the American psychologist who pioneered the experimental approach to social psychology. He published a book titled Social Psychology, and it ended up defining the field for decades to come. Freud was able to synthesize behaviorism and psychoanalysis. He understood that behaviorism provided scientific rigor, and psychoanalysis described important social dynamics. Another reason his book has had lasting impacts is because it addresses personality. He knew that not all people react the same way in a given situation. Freud emphasized that personality drives behavior. Gordon is the brother of Floyd. They worked together while making contributions to the field of personality psychology. Gordon is the American psychologist who is recognized as the founder of modern personality psychology. He is best known for his trait theory. A trait is a stable internal characteristic of an individual that is a determinant of behavior. He believed that traits could be biologically based. A nomothetic approach is a research style of examining many examples to derive generalizations. An idiographic approach is a research style of examining individual persons in great depth. Gordon was more fond of personality psychologists using the idiographic approach. Floyd's beliefs compare greatly to the behavioristic theory. Personality amounts to little more than the sum total of learned responses to environmental stimuli, which means that personality is shaped more by external forces than internal ones. Gordon is the brother of Floyd. They worked together while making contributions to the field of personality psychology. Gordon is the American psychologist who is recognized as the founder of modern personality psychology. He is best known for his trait theory. A trait is a stable internal characteristic of an individual that is a determinant of behavior. He believed that traits could be biologically based. A nomothetic approach is a research style of examining many examples to derive generalizations. An idiographic approach is a research style of examining individual persons in great depth. Gordon was more fond of personality psychologists using the idiographic approach. Floyd's beliefs compare greatly to the behavioristic theory. Personality amounts to little more than the sum total of learned responses to environmental stimuli, which means that personality. Julian Rotter is known as the American psychologist who developed a social learning theory of personality and the concept of locus of control. Roger was specifically interested in Lewin's levels of aspiration theory, which is a proposal that successful completion of the task depends not only on ability, but also the motivation to complete it. Internal versus external control of reinforcement means the belief that life events are the outcome either of personal effort or outside forces. Some people believe that the events that happen in their life are out of their control, while others think it is a direct result of their actions. Another term for this theory is locus of control, which is part of the social learning theory of personality. The social learning theory of personality is Rotter's account of individual differences as developing through divergent life histories. Julian Rotter is known as Walter Mischel is one of the most influential psychologists to this day. He is famous for his marshmallow test and is known as the Austrian-American psychologist who advocated for a social cognitive approach to personality. Walter called a problem the personality paradox, which is the observation that people's behaviors are inconsistent across a wide range of situations, even though our intuitions tell us that individuals display enduring personality traits. Walter argued with psychologists during the 1970s about whether personalities or situations are the main determinant of behavior, and this is called a person versus situation debate. Walter had a solution to the personality paradox, and he called it a social cognitive approach, which is a model of personality proposing that behavior is driven by the individual's unique interpretation of a given situation. Walter Mischel is one.
As we continue to study the field of psychology, we must understand that as our world changes, so do the views of specific schools of psychology and the theories that are proposed within those fields. These next slides will discuss the contemporary views of some of the major theories within the developmental and personality psychology, recognizing the importance and frequent use of these theories to allow growth in the schools of psychology and the field of psychology as a whole. As we start to look at the theories proposed in developmental psychology, we will begin with the attachment theory. The attachment theory that was proposed and researched by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth is consistently referenced in new and recent studies focused on the development of children, especially in terms of relationships. A 2013 study completed by Cassie, Jones, and Shaver researched the connections between attachment and several child factors, including child psychopathology, which could potentially lead to disorders in adulthood, child neurobiology, health and immune function, empathy, compassion, and altruism, school readiness, and the culture of the child. The goal of the study was to determine practical applications of research to reduce the occurrence and maintenance of insecure attachment from infancy to adulthood. The continued research on this topic and further connections show the importance of attachment theory and the evidence that continues to support it. Clearly, the contemporary view on attachment theory is that it is relevant in today's society, and we continue to use that to our advantage. Next, we will discuss security theory. While the security theory originally proposed by Mary Ainsworth continues to be utilized and referenced in studies, more recent studies have evolved the potential views of the theory. For example, Davies and Martin 2013 emphasized the importance of formulating emotional security in children. Since the authors found that the child's interparental relationship is key to them formulating successful and effective emotional security, it proves that Ainsworth's security theory is still relevant. However, it highlights the importance of other types of security for children to experience optimal development. Once again, we see an evolved view of the theory, but the foundation that the security theory has created cannot be overlooked. We continue to use it for more and more studies of this kind. Next, I will talk about social learning theory. Social learning theory is just as important now as it was when Albert Bandura proposed it. Today, we see all kinds of different examples of this theory in our everyday lives, from childhood all the way through adulthood. As we recognize our ever-changing society, especially key technological advances, we also realize how social learning theory and its principles must be represented differently. As we continue to see more and more of our world move online, we must focus on continuing to incorporate social interaction as a means for learning. Hill, Song, and West 2009 provides important implications for the education field as we begin to navigate through distance learning. These researchers found that social learning is vital for the success of online and distance learning. Further, they note the increased importance of learning acceptable social skills both online and in real life. As covered, social learning theory is an idea that will never be irrelevant, but the circumstances and situations that we learn in will continue to evolve and adapt. Therefore, our views and learning must evolve and adapt too. Another important theory proposed by Bandura that we must look at is the social cognitive theory. As I began my research on the contemporary view of social cognitive theory, I found a copious amount of recent research articles and studies on the application of social cognitive theory in various areas of one's life. Examples range from academic advising to coaching athletes, from training for computer skills to intergroup contact research, from age differences in motivational orientation to reducing bullying. The possibilities for applying this theory in everyday life are seemingly endless, and it seems quite popular to use it. Swearer et al. 2014 researched and studied the social nature of involvement in bullying. Social cognitive theory not only provides principles that help better understand why people who bully others behave the way that they do, it also guides the development of interventions that encompass all the psychological, cognitive, and social characteristics that are exhibited by students who bully others. This is just one example in which social cognitive theory is expressed in everyday life and how it can be utilized to promote better outcomes. It is quite clear that this theory is a popular one among psychologists and researchers today, and it will continue to be that way for some time. As for the contemporary view of the entire school of developmental psychology, there is an argument that the school lacks a couple of key perspectives that would make the school more comprehensive. Many studies have found that developmental psychology is incomplete because it lacks comparative and cross-cultural perspectives. Nielsen and Hahn 2016 reviewed recent research that has been focused on the aspects of developmental psychology, such as social cognition, social learning, cooperation and collaboration, pro-social behaviors, and theory of mind. Throughout the review, they found several studies that cover these aspects, yet there is very little collaboration and synthesis of findings across cultures. In order to become a more complete field, developmental psychology must give more attention to culture and the evolution of the cultural minds of humans. Overall, developmental psychology offers important theories and concepts and is a vital school to understanding the life of the human and their mind. Research continues to this day on these aspects. As we start to look at the theories proposed in developmental psychology, we will begin with the attachment theory. Personality psychology can be considered both a broad and narrow field. Because personality psychology focuses solely on the development of personality in every individual, it is difficult to focus on the specific theories as they are often used in collaboration to understand the development of one's personality. For us to understand the current contemporary view of this school of psychology, we must look at the field as a whole instead of the individual theories. As a note, I have provided a few of the theories that were proposed in the School of Personality Psychology for you to review and look at as I discuss my research. Since a major part of personality psychology involves understanding and viewing ourselves in a certain way, I thought it was important to find a couple of studies that are focused towards self-related concepts and individuality. While McAdams' 1996 is not exactly recent, he provides many concepts that are still relevant today. Specifically, he discusses how modern adults create their identities through psychosocial construction of their life stories. This gives into the idea of social learning theory and the ways that we learn to modify our actions, thoughts, and behaviors. This still holds value today because young adults are in constant conflict to identify themselves on their own terms and on society's terms. An overarching view of personality psychology now is that it needs to be shifted or revitalized to create more opportunities for the school to be implemented and studied. McAdams' 2006 calls for recontextualization of new and future personality studies, especially in terms of culture, gender, class, ethnicity, and the social ecology of daily life for humans. Further, he discusses the need for understanding psychology in terms of dispositional traits, characteristic adaptations, and life stories. Additionally, he places an emphasis on studying the redemptive self when understanding and learning life stories. Finally, I would like to reference Ewer 2013 as an article that calls for future research to provide changes that would make personality psychology a more complete and comprehensive school. The author claims that contemporary personality psychology is largely based on psychological knowledge and that explanations used in trait psychology are fundamentally indirect. Further, the findings from this review challenge the common assumptions about the causal and universal status of well-known phenomena explained by prominent personality models. The author is clearly trying to show that this school provides an outdated and irrelevant model for understanding and explaining psychology. Overall, while the contemporary view of personality psychology is not all that bright, the concepts and theories of the school are used frequently within our society. For example, schools and employers often implement personality assessments to better understand the group of individuals that must work together to accomplish specific goals. The School of Personality Psychology has provided applicable concepts, but some serious gaps have been discovered that challenge the school as a whole. therefore creating opportunities for a successful future. Personality psychology can.
To start assessing the importance of personality and developmental psychology in the history of psychology, we'll begin looking at Bowlby's attachment theory. Bowlby started out with the acceptance of Freudian theories. However, Bowlby came to the realization that Freudian explanations weren't supported by the data that he presented. So, to look at a specific situation of this, we'll discuss the case of Little Hans, which was first completed by Freud. Bowlby started out with an initial hypothesis that was based on Freud's findings in this study, but the evidence was modest and very limited. So Bowlby reassessed his hypothesis and completed a systematic review of the case and looked at interviews that had been done with Hans's father and Hans himself, which Bowlby accessed in Freud archives. Bowlby's new hypothesis was supported by many lines of evidence and led to proof of validity in Bowlby's developing attachment theory. This is all important because without Bowlby proving that Freud's findings were biased, it likely would have taken longer to separate these important parts of personality development from the sexuality of an individual, which was what Freud's theories were heavily based on. Moving on, we'll look at the development of Bowlby's and Ainsworth's attachment theories. These were all important because the theories gave psychologists the ability to understand why certain disorders of attachment arise, and they also gave them the ability to form beneficial treatments for the disorders. If we switch over to Bandura and look at his Bobo doll experiment, we'll see that it led to the development of his social cognitive theory. This happened because during this experiment, Bandura realized that the model of the experiment and the way that it was employed in guided mastery therapy was significantly different from the traditional social learning theory. As Taylor mentioned earlier, Eysenck found that hysterics often showed extroverted personality types and neurotics showed introverted personality types. This knowledge gave the individuals who work with this population insight to what they may experience while working with them, and the training of these professionals was also based on Eysenck's scientific practitioner model. Moving on, we'll look at the development of Bowlby's and switching our attention over to Julian Rotter, who developed a 40-sentence completion test intended to detect psychological maladjustment called the Rotter Incomplete Sentences Blank, or RISB. This test became the basis for several researchers and was used for clinical diagnoses during the last half of the 20th century. Looking at Walter Mischel, he designed the marshmallow test with the purpose to look at the delay of gratification of young children. He completed this by giving a child a marshmallow and telling the child that if they wait so many minutes to eat that marshmallow, they would be given an additional marshmallow to enjoy. Throughout history, this test has been used in several studies, many of those studies looking at the effect that poverty can have on a child. Mischel's social cognitive approach to psychology led the field away from the belief that personality traits are consistent across all situations. He achieved this by proving that previous evidence did not support that claim and went on to combine Rotter's social learning and Kelly's personal construct theory. Switching our attention. One last thing that we'll look at in discussing the importance in the history of psychology is in the 1970s when Jerome Kagan challenged the attachment theory. In 1970, the social views were changing and led mothers to seek employment, meaning that children would have to attend a daycare facility. So knowing of this, Kagan set up a study where he went out to determine if there were any behavioral differences between the children who stayed at home with their mother or those who went and attended a daycare facility and received care from an individual outside the home. Kagan ended up finding that there was no difference between these children's development, but he did find evidence that showed that attachment was more than just a bond between a mother and infant, because in his study he saw that the infants had built a bond with the daycare provider as well. So this discovery is important because it shows that all relationships in an infant's life, whether it's with the mother, the father, a sibling, a grandparent, a daycare provider, all of those relationships play a role in the attachment styles and the development of a child. Now we will begin to compare and contrast the two schools of psychology. First, we'll start out by looking at the main focus and goal of each school. Personality psychology looks at the variation among individuals and aims to show how people are individually different due to psychological forces. Developmental psychology aims to explain growth, change, and consistency through the lifespan and looks at how thinking, feelings, and behavior change specifically throughout a person's life. Starting with some differences, looking at developmental, it is heavily focused on attachment styles, social learning, nature versus nurture, and social development, they're all, of course, connected in some ways, but they're also separate ideas, where personality focuses on the trait approach, the dynamic approach, the factor approach, and the social cognitive approach, which are all assessing different ideas within the same concept, whereas development looks at several different concepts and several different approaches within those concepts. Personality psychology, it goes back a lot farther than developmental psychology does. It begins in early ancient Greek, with Hippocrates proposing the first theory in personality, and Hippocrates was alive between 460 and 370 BCE, so that just kind of shows you how far back that goes, where developmental psychology didn't exist until the 20th century was kind of approaching. This is because before then, children were often thought of as mini adults, where they basically just mirrored what adults did. So this belief was so strong that their development was never really considered until the 20th century was coming along. Now we'll kind of focus more on similarities, but also some differences that are within those similarities. Both schools of psychology focus on relationships. Developmental focuses mainly on mother or caregiver relationships, and an infant and personality looks at the relationship of individuals with other individuals around them and an individual and just their environment and the way that individuals feed off of others' energy around them. Where both psychologies show an understanding that people are affected by others and their environment. So this I kind of already touched on, being that Personality looks at the way an individual reacts to their environment and how the environment affects their mood, where developmental shows that the way the mother and caregiver builds an environment for their child within the home can affect the kind of attachment style the child makes. The beginning of personality development is actually really similar to developmental psychology, just because a child is forming their personality at the same time that they're doing most of their developing as a kid, because development psychology focuses on the attachment styles, and the attachment styles affect the personality of the child. So these two psychologies really go hand in hand, so there are a lot of similarities. And then most of the theories and ideas proposed in both of these schools are, of course, based on experimental research. The studies in each of these has a focus on trying to create the most natural environment for the study so that they can get the most realistic results. That's kind of a given, as most studies have that goal. But now we will begin to compare.
And finally, for our discussion questions, we have: what idea does Hippocrates bring to psychology? What are the differences between each attachment style? What do you think is the most important contribution from personality or developmental psychology? What are some other similarities or differences that lie in these schools of psychology? How do we use developmental and personality psychology today? How do social learning theory and social cognitive theory differ? How do these two schools influence other schools' theories and concepts of psychology? What individual do you personally think had the most lasting impacts on the field of developmental and personality psychology today? And how do personality psychology and behaviorism compare? And finally, for our discussion